Namaste. So I chose the title Redemption in Relationships to be intentionally vague. Because I'm of the belief that most of the spiritual life is worked out, and I'll say what I mean by that in a second, worked out through the relationships we have with other people. So I don't mean, when I say redemption in relationships, any particular kind of relationship. In fact, what led me to choose that title for today was the relationship between Peter and Jesus that gets worked out at the very end of the gospel. But what I mean by worked out is, it's kind of like this weekend at the state fair, there was a bike expo, or is probably still going on, a bike expo. And it's one thing to buy a bike. In fact, I talked to somebody over the weekend that was going to go buy a bike because he was relatively new to the area and he's from somewhere warmer than this. I forget exactly where he said. But he had heard that there were hundreds of miles of bike trails in southeastern Wisconsin, which is true, and throughout the state. And he was going to get a bike and ride those trails. But if you've ever not ridden a bike and then rode a bike, you don't just get on it and go for a 100-mile ride. And I was kind of shocked because I hadn't ridden a bike for years, and then several years ago we got bikes, and you know, when I was a kid, my butt never got sore from riding a bike. But now it's like I wanted to go out and get one of those big old cushy seats, tractor seats, yeah. And it's not even just that. I mean, you go for a couple-mile ride and you're sore. And so that's what I mean by working things out. It's one thing to know a principle. It's another thing to apply the principle. And it's a third thing still to learn from that. And that's one of the things that I think Bob Thurman is trying to get at in this first reading when he starts talking about relationship and this curious thing about what most people find curious is this idea that even if somebody is punching you in the face and you decide that it's not a good idea and you can't get them to stop, and you might decide to physically stop them, but you shouldn't get angry. Now, I'll admit it's probably a pretty big challenge if somebody walks up to you and hits you in the face to not get angry. But I learned a lot about this idea of having to be physical in terms of stopping somebody from doing something when I worked in hospitals. And it is almost surreal because I think we're culturally conditioned, especially through movies and television, to believe that if we're stopping somebody physically, that with that has to come anger, a sense of being insulted, and a certain amount of being out of control. And yet, in healthcare environments, when you're restraining somebody, there's no room for anger. You have to be in absolute control. And it's almost surreal because it's not personal. So it's not as if you get somebody to where they're safe and you find yourself stomping around really angry about what just happened. There's a certain detachment. And I think that's part of where we struggle in all of our relationships. I found that driving Uber is like a mini relationship voyeuristic experience because all kinds of people in all kinds of relationships call for Uber rides. And they don't stop talking about whatever's going on while they're in the car. And I see certain styles of negotiating different things. You know, and It doesn't matter really if it's friendships or romantic relationships or people that work together. And I see different degrees of healthiness in how that's done. And I see different degrees of manipulation in how that's done. For example, are people just honest about what they want to do? Or does one partner in a relationship say to another, oh look, there's a yoga place, he says. And she says, yeah, I know. He says, have you checked it out? She said, no, I haven't had time. Well, I would go there with you if you wanted to, he says. She says, oh. A few blocks later, would you care if after we got home I went over to Mike's? Oh, so were you really interested in yoga, or was it a negotiating strategy to get to go to Mike's? And how do we get to that place where we're more honest? Or the group of male friends who are discussing things. Have you heard from Henry? No, I haven't heard from Henry in a while. Gee, you used to talk to him all the time. Yeah, I know. Well, what happened? He's probably mad because I never call him anymore. What do you think? And so, relationships are these things that, on the one hand, require work, and on the other hand, require a certain amount of detachment in that we have to learn to let the other person be who they are. But there are cultural forces that mitigate against that. Jim and I were in the car together yesterday, and a commercial came on for Heritage Funeral Homes. And it starts out by saying, funerals are difficult things. And I thought, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. And then they said, it's hard to find the right words to say. Fortunately, Heritage Funeral Homes has a website. And you can go to that website, and first I'm thinking, oh my God, they're going to try and talk you into skipping the funeral. I mean, talk about a way to destroy a friendship. You can type in your message of sympathy. I mean, every funeral home has this now. This isn't unique. And that way, when you go to the funeral, you can just talk about memories. And I thought, who could walk into a funeral and not say to the family or the friends of who lost a loved one, at least, I'm so sorry? What are you going to do, walk in and say, the funeral home has a website. I wrote my stuff on there. Well, And I think even as opportunities arise for us not to talk to one another honestly, we need to fight that temptation to not talk to each other honestly. And that's all about what happens here with Jesus around the fire with Peter. This translation is kind of odd, and then it said Peter put a coat on and jumped into the water. The older translation said cloak, I guess. They're afraid nobody knows what a cloak is. But, it's not like Peter was throwing on a parka and going swimming. We all know that'd be a pretty bad idea. But in addition...
The Polar Bear Club.
The Polar Bear Club, yes. But in addition to this curious thing that they don't quite recognize who Jesus is yet again, you might wonder why it is that Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? And most scholars agree that the reason that he asks him 3 times is that Peter denied knowing him 3 times, if you'll remember, after the arrest. And what's kind of interesting about that is it becomes a little ritual. It's not that Jesus wants to rake Peter over the coals because he didn't stand by Jesus or because he denied him. It's because he wants to restore that relationship in a way that is more than just saying it's okay. And one of the things that came up in the book that we're discussing right now, in the chapter that we read for this week, was this idea that having ritual binds and bonds a group together, makes a group more cohesive. And I sometimes wonder if one of the things we lose as we become more and more individualistic and participate less and less in group things with other people are these rituals. People have suggested for really a significant amount of time now that we should have some kind of ritual even for the ending of relationships. That since we all get together and celebrate weddings, shouldn't there be a way that we get together and mark the end of a relationship, even if it wasn't a marriage? Shouldn't there be a way that we're reassured that just because we're no longer friends with Fred anymore, the rest of our friends aren't going to abandon us. They're going to stand with both of us. Shouldn't there be a way that we can recognize that some relationships last a long time, others don't, but in the end, every relationship ends because one of us dies, if for no other reason than that. And wouldn't recognizing that and recognizing it as a group of friends maybe lead us to appreciate our relationships more? There's a curious idea in one of Paul's letters that is troubling to a lot of people, and it's troubling to me sometimes. But he talks about working out your salvation. And strict people who strictly believe that all you have to do is believe, and you're saved, which is a problematic concept for me, say that there shouldn't be anything to do, there shouldn't be anything to work out. But I think relationships are a way in which we really do that. Maybe better than work out, we might understand it today as live out. How do we live out what it is to be a spiritual person or a person of faith? The place we're going to get tested, the place we're going to grow, is in our relationships with friends, neighbors, acquaintances, co-workers. And they're not all going to be nice. And they're not all going to be easy. But I promise you that within each and every one of those, there is a lesson that we can take away. Even if it's that, maybe I didn't really want to get together with that person. And that is probably the primary testing ground and the primary exercise yard and the primary living out of what it is to be a spiritual person.